I'm just excited about what the Lord's doing here. If you'll turn in your Bible to Mark chapter 11, we're going to continue in our journey through Mark's Gospel. Anybody ever heard of the show Undercover Boss? No. So, like all other reality TV shows, or most of them anyway, they kind of come and go, right? Like they're here and then they flame out and then the next reality TV show comes. Well, Undercover Boss was a show about CEOs of companies who would disguise themselves and kind of work their way into really kind of the everyday life of their companies. And they would interact with employees and find out things sometimes that they didn't want to know were going on in their companies. And then, of course, every episode would kind of end with this heartwarming story of the CEO finding out something hard going on in the life of one of their employees and then granting them this gift, and, you know, there were tears and all that kind of stuff. Well, I want you to have that show in the back of your mind as we walk into this passage today. Because this passage, if I was going to give this sermon a title, it would really be The Ultimate Undercover Boss. Because last week, we saw that when Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem, he made a beeline straight for the temple. Now, why did he do that? Because this was the God of Israel coming home. This was the glory of the God of Israel re-entering the temple. And we saw that he entered that temple not as a tourist, but in order to assess it, in order to determine whether or not there was health or unhealth there. Well, in our passage today, Jesus, having gone back to Bethany on Monday and having then re-entered Jerusalem on Tuesday, walks right back into the temple, into that most authoritative place, now to have conversations with those who were the spiritual authorities of the temple. And this entire passage, from the end of chapter 11 all the way through chapter 12, focuses on that confrontation. And the real question of the passage is, who is the ultimate spiritual authority of Israel? Who possesses authority? Is it the religious leaders or is it Jesus? And you're going to see very clearly by the time we walk our way through this passage that Mark has an answer to that question. So let's dive in this morning, and we're gonna move pretty fast because we've got a lot of ground to cover. But I hope you see the connections between all of these individual stories. Verse 27, and they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. And they said to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do them? Now, what things are they talking about? Remember, just one day prior, Jesus had gone into the temple, he had turned over tables, he had run out the money changers and the people buying doves and various things like that. He had ransacked the place, and he had dared anyone to walk back through the temple courtyard. Well, Mark told us in that passage that the chief priests and the elders overheard him when he went about ransacking the temple. So here he comes on Tuesday morning back into the temple, and a delegation from the Sanhedrin comes to him and says, whoa, buddy, we saw what you did yesterday. You're going to have to stop right there. What gives you the right to do what you did? Tell us, who authorized you to ransack this place? Because in case you didn't know, we're in charge here. Right? That's essentially what they're saying. So Jesus, and I love these things, right? Like Jesus does this numerous times in this passage. He knows exactly what's going on in their hearts. So he says, all right, guys, I'm going to ask you one question. Answer me, and I'll tell you by what authority I do what I do. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. So he puts a command to them, and he says, answer me. And they discussed it with one another, saying, if we say from heaven, he's going to say, well, why did you not believe John? But if we say from man, they were afraid of the people, for all the people held that John was really a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. Spoiler alert, that's a lie. Okay? They did know. The only reason they had to pull back and discuss it among themselves was not because they were concerned with a right answer or a wrong answer, but because they were concerned with image and reputation. Okay, the only reason they conferred among themselves was to decide which way they were going to answer, pending on the answer that would cause them the least amount of publicity damage. All right? That's all they were concerned with. And Jesus knew that. And so when he says, tell me, was John's baptism from heaven or was it from man? It was really a roundabout way of answering their question about authority. Because if you go all the way back to the beginning of Mark's gospel, what do you find Jesus doing? You find Jesus being baptized by John and inaugurating his public ministry as a response to John's baptism. So here's the deal. If the religious leaders would have answered, you know what? We believe John was a prophet from God. It would have automatically led them to the right answer about who? Jesus. Get it? So Jesus was trying to lead these stubborn horses to water, but they didn't want to go because they weren't really interested in giving themselves to Jesus. They were interested only in asserting their power and make sure Jesus knew again who was really in charge in the temple. So they say, Jesus, we don't know. And then Jesus tells them a story. All right? Verse 1 of chapter 12. And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. When the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard, and they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent to them another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and him they killed. And then he sent another, and so on with many others. Some they beat and some they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Now, if you'll remember Jesus' baptism, right? The voice from heaven spoke over him. You are my what? My beloved son. In you I am well pleased. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, well, they'll respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. Now, what do you think the owner of the vineyard is going to do when they kill his son? Not really hard to figure out, okay? Jesus says he will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Now, Jesus tells the Sanhedrin delegation this story really for the main purpose of showing them that though they may think they're in charge, they really aren't. Basically, they're essentially tenants, under shepherds, put in those places of leadership by the vineyard owner who is who? God. Right? And throughout the history of Israel, prophet upon prophet upon prophet has been sent to warn these people of their sins and to warn the religious leaders of impending judgment. But what does Jesus say they've done? They've killed and they've maimed and they've beaten servant after servant of the vineyard owner. Well, the vineyard owner thinks, man, if I send my son to them, if I send the heir, if I send the one who comes with my authority, surely they'll respond differently. No. In fact, they use some really faulty logic. Because they say, this is the heir. If we kill him, there won't be left anyone to inherit the vineyard. So we can take it. Now, y'all, we all know that that's wrong thinking. Who thinks, wow, I'm going to go into this house, I'm going to rob it, and I'm going to kill the inhabitants, and then their house will be mine? No, that's not how things work, right? Well, Jesus says that because of their infidelity, because of their unfaithfulness to the vineyard owner, the vineyard is actually going to be taken from them and given to others who will be faithful with it. But I want you to notice what Jesus says about how the death of the Son is going to be used by God. Verse 10, have you not read in the Scriptures these words? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So Jesus is telling these religious leaders that though they think they have the authority to judge him, God, the vineyard owner, is actually going to pass judgment on them. But here's the deal. Even though they will kill the son of the vineyard owner, God is going to use that death to bring about something marvelous and remarkable, which is exactly what the death of Jesus accomplished. The salvation of a people from every tribe and tongue and nation. And those who put Jesus down and thought that they had stopped him didn't, because what did God do? He exalted Jesus to the highest place. And what you have here in this whole passage are a set of reminders about the kind of authority that Jesus, the exalted one, wields. In this first interaction and through this story, we're reminded that we're not in charge. Jesus is. And Jesus, in submission to the vineyard owner, is the one who is in charge. Now, you and I, like the religious leaders, naturally resent being told we're not in charge. Just ask the 2-year-old. Okay? Promise you. Many 2-year-olds will respond with much more honesty than you and I do. That little 2-letter word is the most important word in their vocabulary. What is it? No. We don't like being told we're not in charge. But Jesus comes into the scene here, and he comes into our lives, and he does that because he's gracious. The voice of the evil one, the voice of the serpent whispers in our ear that we are in charge, that we can have it our way, that we can choose to be anything we want and live any way we want, and there won't be any consequences. The Son, the servant king, says, you're not in charge. And that's his grace. That's his grace. So we have the setup now for everything that follows. All right, verse 12. And they were seeking to arrest him, but they were afraid of the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they left him and went away. Now you have this group called the Sanhedrin, which was essentially the most important political and religious body in ancient Israel. The group called the Sanhedrin was made up of 71 men from 3 different groups: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, who were kind of the Bible experts of the day. So this entire delegation, or a group of them, come to Jesus. They don't get anywhere. They pull back, and then they each come to him, one group at a time. The Pharisees first, then the Sadducees, and then the scribes. And they all pose individual questions to Jesus, designed to trap him and to trip him up, designed to expose the fact that he really has no authority. But he turns the tables on them every single time. And they end up walking away, nobody able or dare to ask him any more questions. So let's walk through these. Verse 13. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. Now, real quick, Pharisees over here, right? They were resentful toward Rome because they did not like the fact that the Romans were occupying the Promised Land. The Herodians over here were sympathetic to Rome, right? So normally these people would have been on opposite sides of the room, opposite sides of the political fence, but now they come together because they have a common enemy in who? Jesus, right? So they come together to trap him in his talk, and they came and they said to him, now do y'all know what flattery is? All right, just check. Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Now, is that true? Absolutely. Are their hearts in it, and do they mean it?
No.
Absolutely not. It's nothing but flattery. And then here comes the question. For you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now see, even then, 2,000 years ago, the topics of religion and what? Politics are topics for fiery conversation. You got to understand that especially in the temple, right? In this place, which was essentially off limits to Rome, the Jews had their own jurisdiction there. This was a volatile question to ask. And so they put it in front of Jesus, expecting him to get tripped up. Because guess what? If he says, yes, pay your taxes, what are all of the common folk going to do? Oh, we don't like you anymore. We don't want to pay taxes to Caesar. But if he says, don't pay your taxes, what's going to happen? Rome is going to come down on him, and he'll feel the full weight of the Roman Empire. But Jesus, knowing their hearts, all right? What does it say? But knowing their hearts, he said to them, why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius, which was a coin equivalent to about a day's wages, and let me look at it. The second thing we learn about Jesus' authority in this passage is that Jesus always pushes right past our pretensions and goes straight to the heart. Every time. He doesn't play around. He doesn't coddle us in our self-deception. Very honestly and very straightforwardly, he says, what are you guys doing? Why are you putting me to the test? Why are you asking me this question? Now let me press pause for a minute. Parents, kids are in this room today, all right? And I love it when we have family Sundays. And if your kids, as they grow, begin to ask you questions about God and about Jesus and about... And if you don't know the answer, one of the best things you can do is to say, well, I don't know. And then say, but let's walk together and try to discover the answer. Now, those are good questions and those are good opportunities. But sometimes people ask questions and all of their questions are just smoke screens hiding the fact that they just want to stiff-arm God. Okay? And that's what's happening here. It's not a genuine question. It's designed to trap us. And so they bring him a denarius. And Jesus looks at him. And he says, okay, I want you to tell me whose face is on it. And they say, well, Caesar's image is on it. And Jesus answers them brilliantly. He says, well, if Caesar's picture is on it, then it belongs to him. So give it to him. But that thing which belongs to God, give that to God. Right? Now, you've all maybe most of you, maybe all of you have heard the famous statement, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render unto God the things that are God's. The great implication of the passage and the great implication of the confrontation between Jesus and the religious leaders has less to do with taxes and more to do with their hearts. You see, Jesus says, because Caesar's image is on the coin, give it to him. But you bear the image of who? God. So yeah, all well and good. Give Caesar what belongs to him. But your real problem is you're not submitting yourself to the God who made you. You see, it's a confrontation about where their loyalties lie. It's a confrontation with the religious leaders that exposes their hearts of self-centeredness and selfishness and self-righteousness. And Jesus says to them, knowing what's in their hearts, you give the coin to Caesar, but you give yourselves to God. They weren't doing it. Not at all. He was right there in front of them. And they would rather kill him than submit to him. You know, we naturally resist the claim of God upon our lives. Not only do we want to be in charge, but we are so self-deceived. We are so self-deceived that we think we're walking the right path and doing the right thing for the right reasons. And the Bible tells us that our hearts are deceitfully wicked. And we need somebody like Jesus, like the servant king who can just peel back the layers and push past all of our pretensions and say, not only you're not in charge, but you were made to love God and to submit your whole life to Him, and you're not doing it. You're not doing it. That's grace. That's grace. But Jesus goes further still. So they marvel at him because of his response, and the Pharisees and the Herodians back off. Well, here comes wave 2, round 2. The Sadducees came to him, and they say that there's no resurrection. All right, just a quick intro. You have the Pharisees and you have the Sadducees. The Pharisees believed in the entire Old Testament, okay, from Genesis all the way through Malachi. The law, the writings, and the prophets. They also subscribed to the written and oral traditions. The Sadducees were pretty much the theological liberals of their day. They believed only in the Torah, the first 5 books. Okay? They didn't subscribe to anything else. And because they believed that a resurrection from the dead was not taught in the first 5 books, they believed that when you died, you ceased to exist, that was it. They also believed in no angels, no demons, nothing but here and now. All right? But they come to Jesus and they ask him a question about the resurrection, which is kind of odd until you realize that they're trying to expose the absurdity of the idea and again trap Jesus in a dilemma. So they say, verse 19, Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife, but leaves no child, the man must take the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Great. Remember that idea in the book of Ruth about a man having a wife, and if the husband dies, then the brother is supposed to take the wife and produce heirs for the dead brother so that he'll have someone for his name to continue and the inheritance and all that stuff. All right? So that's what is going on right here. He says, because you neither know the Scriptures nor the power of God. For when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are they given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. So he says, okay guys, he says, first of all, you don't rightly understand what I would call the manner of the resurrection. How it's going to be when all of us who are in Jesus experience the resurrection of the dead. Okay, marriage is going to be a thing of the past. Jesus says all of us will experience life in the afterlife like the angels in heaven do. Now what does that mean? Are you ready for this? I don't know. Okay? Ain't none of us been there. Ain't nobody come back to explain to us what that means. But Jesus is essentially saying, guys, it's not going to look like anybody around here thinks it will. It's going to be different. There's not a one-to-one correspondence between this life and the next. All right? So they misunderstand the manner of the resurrection. But notice what else he says. He says, and as for the dead being raised, so the actual fact of the resurrection, he's addressing the fact that they don't even believe it's going to happen. He says this, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush? Now here's the brilliance of Jesus. What did I tell you that the Sadducees only believe in? The first 5 books of the Old Testament. Where is he quoting from? Number 2, Exodus. The book of Exodus. And he's about to prove to them the reality of the resurrection. So he says, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to Moses, saying, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Again, you are quite wrong. Now, this passage might look to us on the surface like a terrible argument for the reality of the resurrection. But I want you to think with me for just a second, right? God made promises to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob in the book of Genesis regarding all of these things that God had for them in the future. Right? Let's just go through them real quick. God promised Abraham a great name. God promised Abraham descendants that would outnumber the stars. God promised Abraham an eternal inheritance of a piece of land. Right? Did Abraham die having received, having seen, having experienced any of those things? None of them. None of them. Well, if there's no resurrection, in other words, if Abraham is gone, then God's promises have come to what? Nothing. But Jesus is arguing that when God promises something, God will fulfill whatever that something is to whomever he has promised it to. Which means that if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob died in faith, not having received an answer to those promises, guess what? They're what? They're still alive. They're still alive. Because those promises to them have yet to be fulfilled. Do you see what he's doing? And he's saying, guys, you missed it. You missed it. Jesus is not afraid to correct error. He's not afraid to correct error. And you know how he does that in the life of the local church among us? It's right here. This is how he does it. Jesus did it through his spoken word in the midst of these religious authorities. And now today he does it through his written word in the power of his Spirit. Not only telling us we're not in charge, not only pushing past our pretensions to our heart, but showing us where we're in error. And he does that because he's the way, the life, and the what? The truth. The truth. Well, Jesus goes even further still. Verse 28, and one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, which commandment is the most important of all? Now, this one seems like a more genuine conversation, okay? This particular expert in the Old Testament came to Jesus, having watched Jesus engage with these various other parties. And so being an expert in the Old Testament, he comes to Jesus and he says, okay, Jesus, I want to hear your answer. How would you summarize everything in the Old Testament? Jesus entertains the question. And he says in verse 29, the most important command is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." In other words, God is the most important factor in the whole universe. Right? "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." Now, how much of yourself should you give to God? Just so we're clear. All of it. Everything. And then he goes on to say, the second is like this: "You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." Now, the commandment to love God is superior. It's first. It's paramount. But Jesus attaches the commandment to love neighbor to it. And he says by doing so that you can't have one without the other. Right? To love God and to do it rightly is to love who? My neighbor. And the only way that I can rightly love neighbor is to love God first. And Jesus says that the two of those fit together like puzzle pieces that make a complete picture that can't be understood if they're ripped apart. Now, here's something interesting. Verse 32. "And the scribe said to him, 'You're right, teacher. You have truly said that God is one, and there is no other besides him. And to love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than whole burnt offerings and sacrifices.'" Now here's what I want you to see, okay? This scribe, after hearing Jesus' response, says, "Jesus, you're right." In fact, it may have never been articulated the way that Jesus does right here before. But the scribe says, "Jesus, you're right." God desires our love, our affection. He desires our everything more than he desires whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. So in some way, shape, or form, this teacher of the law gets it. But here's the important thing, okay? And this is what you need to watch. Verse 34, "And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to him, 'You are not far from the kingdom of God.'" Jesus loves you and I enough to expose the gap, the deadly gap that exists between head and heart. Because this scribe knew the law well enough to commend Jesus' answer, and they know and Jesus knew well enough to agree that he had the right answer. But Jesus said, "You're not there yet. You're not there." Why? Because although this distance may be 18 inches, there's a huge difference between saying, "Yes, Jesus, you're right," and surrendering to Jesus. He says, "You're not far because you understand it, but you're not there yet because you've not surrendered your life to me." This is the King of the kingdom inviting the scribe in. "Come to me. Move from here to here. Move from right understanding to giving your life over." And you know, Jesus is so gracious to us as well, because he won't let us get away with simply having the right answers. Jesus doesn't want the right answers. He wants you. He wants you. He wants you. Your mind, your heart, your soul, your strength, your everything. Everything. Well, here's what happens, right? Jesus has answered all of their questions. He's bested every one of them. And what does Mark say? After that, no one dared ask him any more questions. You think? Yeah, who wants to be on the other end of some of those responses, right? In the public place of the temple where the crowds are probably gathered around and they're going, "Man, did you see what Jesus did to them?" And the religious leaders are kind of walking away with their tails between their legs, and Jesus is going, anybody else? Anybody else? But he doesn't stop there. He says, okay, let me ask you a question. So he turns it around. And Jesus taught in the temple, he said, how can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? David himself and the Holy Spirit declared, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord, so how is he his son? And the great throng heard him gladly. Real quick, this quote comes from Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is the most quoted Old Testament passage in the entire New Testament. If you're ever on Jeopardy, and Alex Trebek says, Claire, what is the most quoted Old Testament passage in the New Testament? You can say, Alex, what is Psalm 110? That's it. Okay? Now, the early Christians loved this passage for the exact reason that Jesus points out. The psalmist points out, David, that the Messiah is actually greater than David himself. Right? The Jews believed that the Messiah was going to be a Davidic figure, a descendant of David. But Jesus here brings the conversation full circle, puts the spotlight on himself, and says, nah, yeah, that's true, but that's not all that the Messiah is. The Messiah is much more than a human figure. The Messiah is, in fact, your God, the vineyard owner's son, who has now come to retake what belongs to him. All right? So Jesus doesn't remove himself from the field when there are no more questioners. He steps in the center and says, guys, it's all about me. I want you to come home to me. Repent. Have your understandings of Messiahship reshaped by who I am. And then he closes things out with two scenes, and this is how we're going to close. Jesus alone, as the Messiah and as the God of Israel, has the authority to pass judgment. All right, look at what he does. And in his teaching, he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces, and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Jesus, speaking to the crowd, pushes past all of the baloney and all of the questions and all of the pretensions of the religious leaders. And he says, let me tell you what's really going on in their hearts. Okay, they are abusive leaders who care nothing for other people, who only use their power and their spiritual authority to get ahead, to get the best seats, to step on the backs of others, and to basically make a name for themselves. They will be condemned. And so Jesus, rather than being the one who is judged, what does he start doing? He starts judging. And he says, I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm going to show you exactly what's going on in their hearts. And if you thought that his actions in the temple got them upset, what do you think they thought when they heard this? Ooh! It's no surprise Jesus is going to be dead in like 3 days. Right? I'm serious. They wanted him gone because he said things like this. But remember, this is God in the flesh coming home and saying that these shepherds are not worthy to lead my people. But then notice the context, okay? And Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watched the people putting money into the offering box. Many rich people put in larger sums. And a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which make a penny. So the denarius was equal to 1 day's wages. The coins that she put in were 1/64th of that. So imagine working for maybe like 10 minutes in a daily work and then putting that into the offering plate. okay? But here's the deal. Jesus commended it. Because he said, he called his disciples to him and he said to them, "Truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the offering box. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Now we took up the offering at the beginning of the service. Did anybody in the room put in everything you have to live on? No. None of us did that. But this little widow woman, who is a distinct contrast from the nicely dressed religious leaders, she gave everything she had. Remember when Jesus said that the greatest commandment amounts to giving everything you have. And remember, throughout the Gospel of Mark, that we've had these little portraits of discipleship, okay? What Jesus is doing, once again, is putting in front of his disciples a picture. You want to know, once again, what it looks like to follow me? Give me everything you got. Now, the issue is not the amount. Some people have more, and some people have less. And honestly, it doesn't really have that much to do with money. It has to do with what? Give him everything you've got. Because you know what? Jesus did that for you. He gave you everything he had. And when we come together on the last Sunday of the month, we remember that. When we share in the Lord's table, we remember that Jesus' body was broken for us, that we might be made whole, that his blood was shed for us, that we might be covered with it as a Passover lamb, so that we might be forgiven and reconciled to the vineyard owner. And y'all, it's important to remember that. Because you and I can hear a message, an important message, about the authority of Jesus, right? The authority of Jesus through his word that condemns our sin, that speaks truth about who we really are, that pushes past all our pretensions, that calls us to a life-giving kind of faith. And you and I can be completely overwhelmed. And that's the point. Because ultimately Jesus says, you'll never get there on your own. You need it. You need it. So as we come to the table this morning, I want you to come eagerly. I want you to come joyfully. I want you to come cognizant of the fact that nobody deserves to sit at his table. Not one of us. But what does he say? Come. Because of his grace, because of his mercy, because of his kindness. Because guess what? He knows everything about you, and he still loves you. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? So what I want you to do is, I want you to bow your heads. Our worship team's going to come. And I'm going to prepare to lead us.